Ambassador Volker, greetings and glad to see you on First Western.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
I would like to start with the history of negotiations with Russia. You've worked as a special representative on this issue. Taking into account today's situation, in your opinion, was it a mistake to negotiate with Russia after the 2014, or it was important to negotiate just to gain some time and build capable Ukrainian forces?
Well, I believe it was important to negotiate in order to try to get Russia to adhere to the Minsk agreements and to get them to withdraw their forces. The Minsk agreement said no foreign forces in Ukraine, to get them to remove the illegal armed groups that they had set up, the Luhansk and Donetsk so-called People's Republics. So it was important to try to go through the effort of negotiations to see whether we could get them to do that. Of course, they failed. They did not do that. They denied that they were even in Ukraine. So the negotiations did not achieve anything, but it was important to make the effort.
Don't you think that they used that time during the negotiations after the 2014 just to prepare to future invasion of Ukraine?
Well, judging by the performance of Russian forces, I don't think they used the time very well.
Also, speaking about negotiations with Russia, you participated in the meetings. Did you feel that Russian counterparts participate in the meetings seriously?
No, not really. I think that they were not empowered to actually agree to anything. I think Vladislav Surkov, who was my counterpart, I don't think he had the ability to agree to withdraw Russian forces or even to create a peacekeeping mechanism. I think it was really an effort to just go through the motions.
And why didn't the US government provide us with modern weapons after the 2014 Russian aggression?
Well, unfortunately, the judgment at the time, and this was both the judgment of Germany under Chancellor Merkel and the United States under President Obama, they thought that providing weapons would provoke Russia, would create new conflict, would escalate the conflict. Of course, that was wrong. It actually would have been important to get Ukraine those weapons at the time so that Ukraine could have deterred future Russian aggression. And during my time as special representative, I made that argument, and we began in 2017 at that point to give Ukraine some of the weapons that it needed. We should have done even more then. We should have gone faster and provided more, but at least we started.
Also, political reports that Biden administration fears possible negative consequences on the possibility of failed Ukrainian counteroffensive. On the other hand, they fear Russian escalation and do not provide us with all types of weapons. Does such strategy make sense?
No, I don't think so, to be honest. I think they're misreading Russia a bit. Russia is in a very weakened position already. They don't have the ability to escalate conventionally much more, if at all. Ukraine needs to move to take back its territory as soon as possible. The suffering in Ukraine is considerable. And we have to recognize that there is no solution here with Putin in power. He's just going to continue fighting as long as he's in power. So that's why Russian forces have to be defeated, because as long as he's there, we have to create some stable defensive position for Ukraine. Hopefully one day the Russian people will come to their senses and remove Putinism as an ideology guiding the country. But until then, we have to help Ukraine defend itself, get its territory back, and that's going to require all the assistance that we can give.
So you believe that peace could be achieved only on the battlefield?
I think that is the precondition. I think that without that, Putin is just going to keep fighting. So we have to achieve peace by pushing Russian forces back and a defeat of Russian military forces. After that, then I hope there is some stability that can be built. But right now, there is clearly no desire on Russia's part to reach any solution.
Let's cover also last visit of Jens Stoltenberg to Kiev. NATO General Secretary visited our capital and had a meeting with President Zelenskyy. In your opinion, why did he visit Kiev before the start of the upcoming counteroffensive operation?
Well, I think it's more that he was visiting Kiev before the Vilnius summit that takes place in early July, I believe. And here, Ukraine is invited. He was delivering an invitation for President Zelenskyy to attend the NATO summit. And there will be statements made at that time about Ukraine's future perspective for NATO membership. So I think it was an effort to consult with Ukraine about that in advance, try to set expectations about what NATO can achieve at that meeting, so that when President Zelenskyy goes to Vilnius, there will be a strong show of solidarity and unity between NATO and Ukraine.
You mentioned a NATO summit in Vilnius. What do you personally expect from the upcoming NATO summit?
Well, what I expect is a reaffirmation of what was agreed in 2008, that Ukraine ultimately will be a member of NATO. Unfortunately, I think NATO is still waiting for the war to end before making good on that promise. And I think what NATO should be doing is creating a clear and direct pathway for Ukraine to achieve NATO membership. I understand that it may not be at Vilnius or the day after Vilnius, but it ought to be sooner rather than later, and there ought to be a clear pathway, a clear mechanism. And I don't think NATO is quite there, but that is what I think we should be arguing for.
And how could such mechanism look like? Like a roadmap plan to membership in NATO?
Yes, so, I mean, Ukraine has basically done a lot of the things that it would have done if it were given the membership action plan. It has had a series of annual national plans. It has trained its military forces. It has gotten them Western equipment. It has made them more interoperable. It is clearly making a contribution to defense of Europe overall. So Ukraine has already done most of what it needs to do. I understand, though, that NATO allies may feel they need to have some stability before they could bring Ukraine in. But that being said, we should create a pathway, we should create an expected timeline or conditions so that it is clear that Ukraine will become a member and that this will be a basis of security for Ukraine in the future.
But unfortunately, Financial Times reports that the US opposes providing Ukraine a roadmap plan to join NATO. What are they afraid of?
Well, again, this is what I was referring to. I don't think NATO is ready to do this yet, but we do need to keep pushing for this. I think in the Biden administration, they, first off, do not want to change the character of the conflict. They don't want it to go from Russia attacking Ukraine and Ukraine defending itself to actually becoming a Russia-NATO conflict, which would be much bigger, involve many more countries. So I think they're trying to avoid getting NATO directly involved in the conflict at this time. They're also concerned that if they took such a step now, while the war is going on and while Putin is in power, it could lead Putin to actually escalate to the use of some kinds of weapons of mass destruction. And people want to avoid that. So that's what they're concerned about. I think these are manageable concerns. I think we should be moving forward. But I think those are what they are thinking about.
But is there any possibility for Ukraine to join NATO before the end of the war?
I think it has to be because, in my view, I'm not sure Russia will ever declare a real end to the war. They're going to maintain their position that Ukraine doesn't exist and it should belong to Russia for as long as Putin is in power and as long as the style of regime that they have in the Kremlin remains there. So we have to get used to the idea that Russia may never declare an end to the war, and that should not stop us from building peace and security and a strong economy and integration of Ukraine into European structures.
In your opinion, if Ukraine joins NATO, for example, tomorrow, would the war stop? Because could Putin fight again the biggest military alliance of the world?
I don't think the war would stop. I think Putin would continue to fight, and he would test NATO's resolve to actually send its own forces to fight against Russia, which I think he calculates NATO does not want to do. The Biden administration, Germany, other countries have made clear that they do not want to be in a fight with Russia. So I don't think that would be a game changer at this stage. I think it matters for the future. I think once the war is settled that we have now, and there is some stability again, having Ukraine in NATO could deter future conflict. I think at that stage, Russia would believe that NATO would be willing to defend Ukraine. At this stage, I think they are so much in the fight that they would keep fighting.
Don't you think that Putin is simply bluffing on the possible war against NATO?
I think he is. He doesn't want it. He's not capable of waging it, but he also is calculating that the West doesn't want it either. So he's using that in order to try to keep this conflict as isolated as Russia versus Ukraine. Even that is not going very well, and Ukraine is, of course, getting a lot of support from the West.
So if he is bluffing, what is the reason for not taking Ukraine to the NATO?
Well, as I said, that would be my recommendation. We should create a clear pathway to do so. But I explained also the reasons that I think the Biden administration has.
Also, let's move to China. Recently, Chinese ambassador to France said that former Soviet Union state lack of basis of sovereignty. Why does he think so? And in your opinion, was it an accidental or intentional statement?
I think it was accidental. I think he got a little overexcited and said some things that are clearly not in China's interest, not Chinese policy. The Chinese later came out and took down his transcript from the website that it had been on. They put out a statement from the ministry saying it's not China's position. So I think they've gone and tried to clean it up quietly. Clearly, though, it was a mistake on his part.
Also, French President Emmanuel Macron recently visited China and had a meeting with the Chinese president. Also, he said that the Europe must reduce its dependency on the United States. Why does he say so?
Well, France has a tradition, and particularly French presidents have a tradition of wanting to show that they are strong and independent and to position themselves against the U.S. to some degree. And he's following in that tradition. He was soundly criticized for this, both in France and in the United States and around Europe. It is a distortion of what is actually French and American interests. Our shared interests are that we build a stronger community by working together. And no one wants France or Europe to be completely dependent on the United States, least of all the U.S. You always hear the United States urging for Europe to do more, to share more of the burden, and it's hard to get Europe to do that.
Don't you think that such statements could broke Western unity?
Well, I think we have a lot of unity because we do have shared values and we do have shared interests. It's unfortunate. I think it was a bad statement to make, and especially bad doing it in China, in a context of China. But I think Western unity will continue.
Also, Bloomberg reports that French President Emmanuel Macron wants to involve China to organize peaceful negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Why does French President Emmanuel Macron wants to organize such negotiations even before the start of the upcoming counteroffensive operation?
Well, first off, he wants France to have a role. So partnering with China, which has already put out a peace plan, and where China has some contact still with Russia, he feels that that could give France a role in a peace settlement. Of course, everybody wants peace. And the thing is that people fail to accept that Putin doesn't want peace. The only country here, the only leader who actually wants a war is Putin. And he's going to keep doing it for as long as he can. So I think it is unfortunate to keep throwing out there the idea of some peace negotiation while he is in that mode. It's much more important to help Ukraine have a successful counteroffensive and take its territory back.
So if Putin doesn't want peace, what is the endgame scenario for the war in Ukraine? Decisive victory of Ukrainian army?
Yes, a defeat for Russia is the end state or the end game that will bring peace. Absent that, Russia will keep fighting.
Also, speaking about negotiations, do you believe that China could be a good mediator for possible negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in the future?
I think if China is more direct with Russia, that is to say, if they are explicit in saying they must withdraw their forces from Ukraine, they must accept Ukraine's international borders. If China delivers that message to Russia, and it's clear that Russia is therefore isolated in its pursuit of seizing Ukrainian territory, I think that actually could be very helpful. And it could be a way to convince Russia that there's no other way, they must withdraw. So far, that has not been the Chinese position. They've been much more vague. The peace proposal they put out refers to sovereignty and territorial integrity, but it's not clear what they're talking about. And they haven't called for Russia to withdraw its forces. So the Chinese need to be a bit more explicit about the basics. But if so, I think it could be helpful.
Also, President Zelenskyy had a telephone conversation with President Xi Jinping. Why is it so important to speak with Chinese counterparts?
Well, ultimately, China has its own interests and is going to be an important player in the world for a century to come. Economically, politically, militarily, I think it is in Ukraine's interest to have a constructive relationship with China to some degree, while pushing back on any security threats that China poses. Position very similar to the US or NATO or others in Europe. And if we can prevent China from actively supporting Russia in its war, that's an important thing to prevent as well.
And what could cause a direct lethal aid of China to Russia? What could cause such scenario?
Yeah, I don't think it is likely to happen because I don't think it's in China's interest anyway. China doesn't want this war. China doesn't want to be dragged into it. China doesn't want its global and regional ambitions to be tied up with Russia's behavior. They have their own sources of strength. They have their own timelines, their own interests. And so I don't think they want to be tied to Russia in this way.
But why does China not condemn Russian aggression?
I think they are trying to position themselves as more of a neutral player, particularly in the eyes of the global South. So whether it's countries in Africa or the Middle East who are wary of the West and also unsure about the future of Russia, China is giving them a way to say, look, we're neither one, and we can play a role in between Russia and the United States and the West. So by positioning themselves that way, they think it advantages China.
Also, let's cover our last topic, UN Security Council and Russian chairing of UN Security Council. Sergei Lavrov participated in the meeting of the UN Security Council. In your opinion, why did the US provide opportunity for Lavrov to physically enter the US and speak on UN Security Council?
Well, because he's representing a regime that has committed war crimes and where the leader is indicted by the International Criminal Court. And it is clear that the whole idea of Russia chairing the Security Council while waging a war of aggression in violation of the UN Charter it's all a farce. And so I think that the administration did the right thing here.
And how could we solve such a problem? Russia is a member of UN Security Council and still has a possibility to participate in the UN Security Council's meetings.
Yeah, I don't see a mechanism right now for changing the United Nations. I have heard some interesting questions raised about Russia's status since it never sought and obtained approval to join the United Nations. There was an assumption made when the Soviet Union fell apart that Russia was the successor, but that has not properly been codified. So that's a question mark. But regardless, I don't see the UN changing, and I don't see the UN becoming functional again as long as Russia is run by someone like Putin.
What do you personally expect from the upcoming months of the war in Ukraine and what we should expect?
Well, I do think that Ukraine is preparing a substantial counteroffensive. We all want this to be as successful as possible. I am reasonably optimistic that it will be successful because Russian forces have proven to be far less capable than everyone assumed. They've been poor in terms of training of personnel, in terms of equipment, in terms of command and control, in terms of logistics. So I think that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has a good chance of making some headway.
Thank you, Ambassador Volker, for your time and participation in the interview, and glory to Ukraine.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.